All right, so I'm William Hurley. I'm Manager of Technical Development at 4-in-1. So today we'll be talking about building real-time applications with Node.js and Drupal. So about 4-in-1, we're a full-service digital agency working with some of the most influential organizations in the world, including a number of federal agencies as well as nonprofits and NGOs. So when we talk about real-time applications, what we're talking about is mostly want to notify folks when things change. And this isn't really a new thing, right? You know, we've had this for, well, about as long as we've had email, potentially, right? You know, someone does something and they receive an email about it. Now that's great, assuming email gets sent on a regular basis. But the problem is when we're talking about this in the context of someone doing something on a website, taking the other person out of it to a email client is maybe not the best part of it. So things have gone a little bit further from there, and you know, this is actually, the inbox is an interesting thing because it's email, but it's also a real-time web application. But you know, when we talk about this, mostly want to talk about in the context of web applications, right? So a user is doing something probably in a context where they're not the only ones doing it. So they want to be alerted, and when other people interact with the system, so they can receive notifications and they can continue to be engaged in that platform. And this is done usually, again, in a couple of different ways. The first one is, and the easiest one is through polling, where it's, you know, the client every so often goes out to the server and says, do you have anything new? If they do, great, they return it. If they don't, then they try again in a certain period of time. Now that's, as I said, very simple. You can do polling against Drupal very easily. The downside with that is it's another request to the web server. And because the whole purpose of it is to get information speedily, then caching doesn't really make a lot of sense there. And Drupal being what it is, handling large numbers of concurrent requests that happen very frequently is really not what it's very good at. The other option is kind of like, okay, say we set aside, you know, we don't want to do it every time the user goes. We want to actually, potentially, we want to wait there, sort of long polling, like make a request to the server, and maybe it has something there, or maybe it'll wait a little bit. Maybe if something comes in the next, I don't know, 30 seconds or something, it's going to hold open that connection and be able to push data over to it. Now that's often commonly referred to as Comet, so that's some stuff there. So, you know, the good news is, again, you remove some of that latency, some of those additional requests you don't have to do. You can just hold open a single connection to the server. The downside is it's a bit of a hack. You know, most of the a lot of gateways and other places expect these connections to terminate, you know, and they will forcibly end them if you go too long. I've heard anecdotally somewhere between 25 and 30 seconds is pretty safe. Much beyond that, you're going to start dropping connections as something between your web browser and the server decides we're done here. And more modernly, what we have is we have Websockets. And that's a low-level persistent connection between you and the server that either of you can push data to at will. You know, so rather than having to periodically reconnect on a long polling or request very frequently on regular polling, you can hold that connection open, that socket open with the server, and when it has new information, you can push it over, and without having to reestablish that connection. And you know, the reason for that is, like, assume for a moment we have an application that we want it to be relatively real time, and that's, you know, somewhere around the 100 millisecond range or less. If we want to have data, information that a user generates be transmitted to other people who are listening to that, for polling, that's you're connecting 600 times inside of a minute. That's a lot. You know, for long polling, you know, you're talking, again, 2 to 3 connections. Again, scale that out to the number of users, and you may or may not get to a large number. For WebSockets, the number of additional requests that you need is 0. Right? You establish the connection when you load the client, and that connection is maintained through the session of the user. So you see, there's no additional handshaking. There's no additional latency for DNS requests or anything like that. You have that connection, and so you've got a lot less time and a lot less effort for the server to return there. So we're going to talk specifically a couple of platforms here that we've used to do this. One is obviously Drupal, right? We're at a Drupal camp, and we do a lot of Drupal. And the reason for that is it is a very robust content management platform. When we're talking about this, we're looking at things that people are doing that we want to store as content. Drupal provides us a great platform to be able to do that data modeling, to do that data persistence and storage, and, well, not have to write admin forms, because I hate writing admin forms. They're really no fun, and Drupal takes that away from me, and I'm good for it. But also realize that say you've got a real-time application, that application may not be the entirety of what you have. You may have, say, an about page, a contact page, some other content that wraps that application that is important. So again, Drupal provides a lot of functionality that's contributed by third parties that means that that's already functionality that you have and you have access to that you can build your application on top of. The next part is when we talk about there's a number of JavaScript platforms on the server using Node.js that exist out there to do WebSockets. We like Sails. I can have a discussion with anyone about whether it's Sails or Meteor or Derby or SocketStream or there seems like there's a good dozen of them. But what Sails gives us is a couple things for nodes. One is obviously the I/O is really fast, right? It's a persistent engine and that's running, and it's really fast. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But also it gives us the ability to share the language that we use to build the client, as well as on the server. So we could refactor and move functionality between them and maintain almost all of the code that we do so. So it makes the writing process easier. It has built-in publish and subscribe mechanism inside Sails, so they have inside their data model that they already have built-in functionality to subscribe to new content of this type, to subscribe to changes of this type, and have that pushed over to the client without having to write that. And one other kind of neat thing is they have an ORM that supports a number of different platforms, ranging from your typical non-relational database like Mongo to Postgres and other relational databases to, in the case we have, REST interfaces. So you can have it where you make a request on their ORM and it goes to Drupal by magic. It's awesome. And when we talk about the I/O, for instance, like looking at a page load, just a very basic Drupal site front page with no content, time to load that page and complete admittedly this is on my local machine, was 900 milliseconds. That's quite a while. Versus loading it through on Node was 25, right? The I/O to do that is just so much faster in Node compared to PHP. Also because Drupal is a very large platform. There's a lot of stuff going on. And when you take that out, big surprise, things go faster. But also when we talk about comparing regular REST calls to, say, WebSockets, you don't have that building up the request and making that. Making a post request via REST was about 1,500 milliseconds when all was said and done to make the request and get the response back. That was a little bit less than half that sending over a request that was already existent with the WebSocket. So there are a couple of challenges that we've run into so far. One is Drupal 8. So the REST interface in Drupal 8, we have one. That's good. The downside is that it's inconsistent in a number of areas. Just to give an example, for instance, like you do GET queries on, say, you want to load node 1 via GET. It's /GET, it's GET/node/1. You would think that to create a node, you would post to node, but you don't. You, in fact, post to /entity/node. Why? I don't know. If Klausy were here, I'd have to ask him. But There's other things, there's no listing page built into the REST interface for Drupal. So you have to create your own one with views. So again, you have 3 potentially different URI patterns to do different requests, which sort of is not the point of REST. The other part is it uses HAL, which is great. I don't know how many folks are familiar with HAL. It's a hypermedia standard for JSON. It allows you to store, to have links to other things and actions and other cool things. They don't support posting or patching using regular JSON. You have to do it with HAL, which begs the question, what links are you posting from the client? It's a good question. And one nice thing is they use patch, so you can do, the idea is you can do partial updates to entities, but there's a number of libraries that don't really support it quite as well as the more typical put. So, no, this is not the end. And I figured we would actually spend most of the time getting into the actual code, because that's really the fun part. So, and the live demonstration, because that's also the fun part. So, right now we've got a very simple to-do app, because everyone loves to-do apps. So for instance, if I go ahead and ta-da! Look, Ma, no hands. Shows up on the other one. And likewise, when we edit it, shows up there. We delete items. So this is a very basic way. Now, what's actually happening under the hood is, this part here is an Angular app. It's a very simple one. It has a very straightforward. Let's go to the videotape. Very straightforward, just list of items, some basic inputs, all these things call, your controller that then basically sends things out to the service. In this case here, we just have some very basic, the basic items, right? You've got update, create, find one, destroy. And then the really important part is where it actually responds to events coming from the server. And literally that's this io.socket_on. So using socket.io. Every time a publication event comes from the server, I receive it here. So the code necessary to make those connections to the server, to do those CRUD things and respond to them is all of 135 lines, including comments and white space. So it gives you an example of the power that both Angular has for sort of that item of the services, but also the socket.io stuff that there's, the reception of it comes over in a very clear mechanism, and you just have to push those over to it. Now, if we're looking at the server side, again, you want to look at that. There's basically some basic, mirrors of those client sides, right? We have the same sort of functions for, again, to find one, to create, to update, and then to destroy. So again, all of that CRUD interface that takes a user request, right? So if we were to look through, a user goes ahead and makes a change. Right? So if we're going to follow that through, they go here, they're done editing this item, goes to done editing. Well, here we basically call the update function on our service. Wrong item. That basically makes that, again, that request over the WebSocket, again, because it's much faster that way. And then makes it over here to update. We get our CSRF token because, security is important. And that part there is one line for us to go ahead and make that request to Drupal through their REST interface. Load it again because all we get from Drupal is a 204, just so we want to make sure that we pass back the data just so everyone's on the same page. And then we publish the update. And all other clients that subscribe to that entity receive that notification and can parse it. So again, you're talking a few lines of JavaScript code there, 20 lines of JavaScript code, some of that including error handling, to make sure that a user can edit something, submit it, and it's broadcast to any other client, regardless of how many others there might be, to receive it. So this part here, the part that actually does that CRUD interface on top of Drupal and normalizes a little bit of their messiness on the rest, comes down to a nice 121 lines, again including comments and white space. So it gives you an idea of the compactness and the power of these platforms that give you to write this sort of functionality very, very easily. Most of the rest of it is very, very straightforward. Clearly we define a model that is a node. It has nothing. It has no information because it's all a reflection of the underlying Drupal REST interface. We have to do a couple of minor other stuff around some other stuff to basically again remove things like you can't provide Drupal an updated timestamp. It complains at you, and some other sort of minor data quality issues around getting the CSRF token in place and some other minor things like that. But again, the code to do that is there were 60 lines. So total weight of code for this to do a real-time app, again, it's pretty naive on top of Drupal is 300 to 400 lines, which is pretty incredible given the power that it brings to people to be able to make that happen. It is up on GitHub, I believe. Let me double check on that. I did push it up there. Wait for it. I have a couple of changes I made today that I haven't pushed, so give me 1 second here. It is private. I should change that. I will change that and update that in my slides before posting it to the event. So yes. Now I will caution you, there are a couple of places where I have patched Drupal. Now the good news is the patches is in the issue queue in Drupal.org. So I didn't randomly make stuff up, mostly. But there are some areas. And I actually did also export the configuration into a tar file from the configuration management side because I did change around the permissions to allow anonymous users to update nodes, which in a real system you'd probably want something slightly more robust than that. But for demonstration purposes, it's okay. So you should be able to just clone this repo and run npm install. And then, assuming that you have Drupal 8 running with this, because this also has all the Drupal 8 code in there, you should be able to run all this stuff as well. In the back, yes?
So is Socket basically responsible for making the REST calls to Drupal kind of effectively replacing like an AJAX call?
So the flow is the client holds that WebSocket connection open with a Sails app. So it makes requests over the Sails app over the Socket.io to Sails. Sails goes ahead and then makes REST calls to Drupal and then transfers it back. So it's essentially acting as a proxy there. The nice thing is, again, it has a very simple interface. It already has a pub sub built into it, and it already has the ability, if I would need to stick on some sort of like LRU cache on top of it, it has a pretty good idiom for doing that. So you wouldn't, again, you'd have something sitting between the user and Drupal, which is always good, but still being able to handle authenticated requests looking to get updates on content. Oh, I left plenty of room for questions. I thought we'd go more. Oh, okay, on the back there.
Did you have to install some kind of REST module to communicate with Drupal?
You mean on Drupal 8?
Yeah.
So we installed the REST UI module basically to enable, to enable certain of the endpoints because by default in Drupal 8, the only authentication mechanism allowed for some of them is via the token. It also only allows HAL-JSON, where we had patched it to also allow JSON. So we needed to enable those routes with that, that type of data.
Oh, so you also had to hook a route?
Hmm?
Did you also have to use a hook to...
No, no. So I only had to do, I can actually show you. There's literally one contrib module in this thing. Oops, it's not config, it's admin config. Awesome. I should know this. So yeah, so basically the REST UI module allows us to enable the formats and authentication mechanisms for the endpoints. By default, it only supports basic auth and HAL-JSON. So if you were to install Drupal 8 and not do anything, you couldn't use cookie authentication to connect. It does not respect sessions. You have to use basic authentication and only HAL-JSON, which is a bit of a problem sometimes. So the REST UI module is, all it does is write to some YAML files for configuration. You could do it yourself if you wanted, but it was just easier to do it through the UI for us. Okay.
Did you find implementing
Yes, we've used Drupal 7. Actually, there's a number of REST services on Drupal 7. I've had good experience with the REST.js module, with a minor exception that it is slow because it does a separate entity, or a check for entity permissions. For every entity, it tends to show transfer over, which for a large number of entities gets very unwieldy. But it supports very good get put post on all of the normal REST endpoints. I've heard good things about the RESTful module. I've never used it. And I confess I have not used the services module since Drupal 5 and had what did I do? Yeah, okay, well, there we go. Fixed. So I've not used the services module since Drupal 5, where I had a really horrible experience with it. So it may be better since then, but I don't know. I can be a little vindictive when it comes to modules. Over here.
If you never really dabbled with any of this outside of Drupal, how would you maybe try to get started? Is there a tool to scaffold things or install the tools you need?
So there's I don't know if you've ever heard of Yeoman. So Yeoman is a scaffolding tool. So it allows you. It's YEOMAN. There's a bunch of what are called generators, which are prepackaged, sort of like ask you questions and write out code sort of things for that for tons of different libraries. The downside is if you were to look up Yeoman for Angular, you would find, I don't know, dozens of different people who have very opinionated ways of what that's going to look like. Some of it's going to be grunt, some of it's going to be gulp, some of them are going to have their services and components this way and others this way. So that part is actually going to be harder, probably figuring out which of the tools and structures make more sense to you. But at least gives you a very good head start on sort of that boilerplate and the arrangement between things. I would start with, again, the client side. And again, I'm a fan of Angular. I've been using it for, I don't know, 2.5 years now. I know that it's no longer the new thing. It's now React, and that's fine. For partisans of React or, Ember, Backbone, we can have that again. We can have that conversation at some point. But I personally am a fan of it.
What was the list then of things to run the different technologies?
Sure. So we're using Angular as the client. So all the stuff here that you see, this UI is all built in Angular. It's Sails.js as the Node framework that includes the Express web server. And then we have Drupal 8. Now, I will caution you that when we talk about Sails, that also includes Grunt and Bower and a whole host of build stuff for Node, because Node's tooling is actually pretty awesome. So much better than PHP's, unfortunately. Back to you.
So what side of the Angular top?
No, it's Sails. It's Sails that's doing it. So we have, we have a very simple layout that all it does is include all of the JavaScript stuff. Lots of JavaScript. And then outputs basically the tag, the ng application tag, to trigger Angular, and then Angular just goes ahead and makes its calls to Sails, and proxies them over to Drupal.
That a production ready website? The sales?
As far as I know. Now, they've been around. They're on, much like this. They're on 0.11, so they've gotten out of the 0.0 stage of life. Now they're on the, that's a very good question. One could ask that about any Node application. I believe so. It's my understanding that it is. The number of folks that have been looking at and doing it, probably not nearly as many as Drupal, but it's got a pretty good set following on GitHub, and a lot of good, a lot of good versions of it. So, honestly, it's a relatively thin layer on top of Express, which is very well supported. So, yes. No, I'm using 1.4. I have not personally done the plunge to Angular 2. At some point, I'm assuming I will. Mostly, I assume when I can ditch IE support less than 11, and I feel like learning TypeScript. I'm not there yet. So, and ES6, because ES6 introduces a whole lot of changes that I'm barely getting used to the new functions in ES5. So, is there someone in the back? Can't see you. All right. Well, I'm happy to go through more code. It would be helpful, or some of the build stuff. Or, always interesting. What do people want to hear about? What can I talk about? Crickets. I can talk about crickets.
I just heard that you wrote the AngularJS module. What is that actually?
So that part there, it does loading of different types, different versions of Angular if need be, but it also allows you to declare that you have directives or services or filters or other things from modules, and have those injected generally and being available to other parts of the system. So you can have somewhat of a decoupled architecture between modules that to add that functionality and modules that wish to consume it. It also has some built-in support for taking templates and either embedding them in script tags on pages or routes that allow you to get them through HTTP without having to write your own hook menu router. So, it's one of those things where it like maybe jQuery update or these other things, like, is it really necessary to have a module? It's Drupal. There's a module for everything, right? We found that it gives a couple of nice things, but it's a little bit more than just I'm including a library, which is, I think, sort of the bar I need to clear on that. There's, being as it's JavaScript, there's only so much hand-holding that it can do for you. All right, I can just add more things. Yeah, I don't think any of the commercial to-do apps are in any danger of this one coming out. It's just the interactions just really aren't all that. My user experience, I'm sure, is not very good. But I like the material design components. Anyone like those material design components? Oh yes, in the back. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I like material design.
Yeah, they're awesome.
I do
Sure.
But so for like most patch and
Mm-hmm.
you send in the token via headers.
Oh yes. So again, this is where it was easier for me to do it at the sales level. So what happens is when I make a create, first thing I do is I get the CSRF token from Drupal, and when that comes back, I then make sure I pass it on to the connection there. So.
That method there though, to get CSRF, what does that actually, where does that live?
Oh, that's just one I created.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah, so it's really simple. The nice thing about it, again, Node is that there's tons of stuff to do there. Uh, there's a module that says get requests and uses the promise interface because promises are awesome. And it literally just make that, and then I can go down here and say, get the CSRF, and then when it completes, go ahead and take that output and just add it onto the request. So. The joys of asynchronous behavior.
What's that URL to get the token?
That is /rest/ session/token. Yeah, so what it does is it gets it from the actual session object that Drupal has for you. So it's actually going to be the same as long as your session doesn't expire because it's stored there. Again, in reality, you'd probably want that on the client, not in the middleware. But, expedience sometimes rules that way. On this one, I'm not storing any sessions. Well, technically, Express, or rather Connect, is providing a session, but I'm not using it at all. So there's from my perspective, essentially the client is stateless. So again, Connect is providing a session. I'm just not using it in any fashion, so it's basically being ignored from my perspective. But yes, it would be stored in the session store that Connect uses, which by default is, I think, in memory. You can set up different ones to be relational databases, Redis, non-relational databases like Mongo on the file system. I've seen people do generate tokens that are then passed around. So there's a whole host of options there on the Connect side. Yes. So the good news about Drupal is, again, that content storage and content modeling is kind of its thing, right? It has that, and it has the ability to represent disparate types of content and pull them together. So in that regard, yes, I could write it something else, but the question is why would I do this? I could. The nice thing about Sails and technically Waterline, their ORM, is I could change that node model to, instead of using REST targeting Drupal, to target Mongo, and nothing else in my app would change. I could change it to be Postgres, and again, nothing in the rest of the app would change at all, other than I'd now have to provide another database. So it's the advantage of being sort of that back-end agnostic portion of their modeling system. But then again, I'd have to store it myself, and this way I can at least, there is a back-end, there is an admin interface. I could go to admin content, look at it there. Right now, that's not connected the other way. So if I change content inside Drupal, it doesn't push that, but you could. Just again, you could have it trigger the REST interface on Sails without a problem. And then again, those changes would be pushed out through the pub sub interface there. So. All right. Well, much like meetings. All right. Everyone has 10 more minutes left in their day. Oh, all right, in the back there.
Just a real quick, you said you could look into the editing on the same content,
Mm-hmm.
You just give like a brief idea of how you do that.
Sure. So in Drupal 7, this is where my unfamiliarity with large parts of Drupal 8 kind of falls down a little bit. But in architecturally speaking, what would happen is you'd have an analog to the hook entity create or hook node create functions. You would then make there's two ways you could do it. One is you could make then a REST call to Sails and hit their create endpoint, or sorry, their edit endpoint or their create endpoint. And that point there, Sails notifies its clients, who then make the request back and get the updates. Right? That would be one way. That's probably the simplest way. The other option would be, because Sails uses Redis to handle its actual publish and subscribe mechanism, I've seen also people go ahead and use Redis directly to push out those messages. So instead of, so they push interface compatible messages to Redis, which then Sails listens for to notify its clients. So one of those two options would work. All right, well, thanks. Oh, do you have any question?
Oh, which is harder to develop in JavaScript or PHP?
I don't know. That's a very good question. I'm personally, I've been doing a lot of JavaScript for the last year and a half or so, and there's a lot of it that I really enjoy. The especially like the map and reduce and sort of all the chaining of functions that libraries like Lodash or underscore give you make data transformation so much nicer. The idioms that they have for that are really nice. The downside is that it's asynchronous. So keeping track of when your code gets called is sometimes more of a challenge. You never know. It's like, oh, well, I just started this thing. It's not going anywhere because you didn't include it in a callback that happens whenever it happens. The inability to rely on, you make a request and then it happens sort of, part that PHP has sometimes makes the logic a lot harder to kind of get into. So I don't know. I don't know if I have an answer for that part. I think it really depends on what languages you know better, and if you're used to PHP, that's obviously definitely going to be easier. But JavaScript's a really exciting time. They're going through a lot of changes, and it's becoming more and more functional and capable, literally by the day. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk about this or anything else that Forum 1 can help with. And we have JJ down here. I'd be happy to talk on how we can partner with you and make some awesome apps.